Right now, refined sugar sits so thoroughly embedded within modern food culture that it's truly easy to forget humans spent the overwhelming majority of our species' existence without any access to concentrated, purified sugar whatsoever. Early humans' actual relationship with sweetness looked considerably different, involving a gradual, seriously interesting historical progression worth exploring properly. Let's dig into this properly, because the answer requires distinguishing between naturally occurring sweetness early humans encountered directly in nature and the considerably later historical development of concentrated, refined sugar specifically. Let's start with early humans' first encounters with naturally sweet foods, because this represents the necessary starting point for this entire developmental story. Early humans almost certainly first experienced sweetness through naturally occurring sources, particularly wild honey and various sweet fruits, likely representing some of the very earliest sweet tastes our species' ancestors ever actually experienced. Honey specifically offers a particularly concentrated natural sweetness compared to most other naturally available food sources, meaning early humans who successfully located and harvested wild honey would have experienced an unusually intense, concentrated sweet taste compared to their otherwise considerably more limited everyday dietary sweetness exposure. This detail matters considerably for understanding humans' actual evolved relationship with sweetness more broadly. Human taste preference for sweetness likely developed as a really useful evolutionary adaptation, since sweetness in nature frequently correlates with truly valuable, calorie dense, relatively safe food sources, particularly ripe fruit, meaning early humans who found sweet tastes particularly appealing and rewarding likely gained genuine survival advantage, more reliably seeking out and consuming these particular valuable, calorie dense natural food sources compared to individuals with less pronounced sweet taste preference. Let's talk about honey hunting specifically too, because this represents a particularly well documented, historically significant early human practice worth exploring in additional depth. Archaeological and anthropological evidence confirms honey hunting represents an extremely ancient human practice, with rock art depicting honey collection dating back tens of thousands of years, alongside continued documented honey hunting practices within various traditional societies observed directly by anthropologists well into more recent historical periods. This particular practice frequently involved considerable skill and courage, given the genuine physical risk involved in successfully accessing wild bee colonies, frequently located within considerable heights or difficult, hard to reach locations specifically to protect the colony from other animal predators also interested in accessing the same valuable, concentrated sweet food resource. Let's talk about early beekeeping and its considerably later historical development too, because this represents an important, distinct chapter worth exploring specifically, extending beyond simply wild honey hunting already discussed extensively throughout this topic. Deliberate beekeeping, actively managing bee colonies specifically to reliably harvest honey, developed considerably later than wild honey hunting, with ancient Egyptian evidence confirming organized beekeeping practices extending back several thousand years, representing a significant technological and practical advancement beyond simply opportunistically locating and harvesting wild honey sources whenever early humans happened to encounter them. Let's talk about other natural sweet sources early humans likely discovered and used across different specific regions too, because this represents an important, geographically varied dimension worth exploring in additional depth. Beyond honey and fruit already discussed extensively throughout this topic, early humans in various specific regions discovered and utilized other locally available natural sweet sources, including maple sap in regions with suitable maple tree species, and various other plant saps and naturally sweet plant materials, demonstrating that early humans' relationship with natural sweetness actually varied considerably depending on whatever specific sweet food sources happened to be locally available within their own particular geographic region and environment, echoing a familiar pattern already explored extensively throughout other topics regarding how early human diet and practical technology closely adapted to local environmental circumstances and available resources. Let's talk about the specific biology underlying human sweet taste perception too, because this represents an interesting, scientifically grounded dimension worth exploring in additional depth before continuing this broader discussion. Human sweet taste perception depends on specific taste receptors located on the tongue, specifically evolved to detect and respond to sugar molecules and certain other naturally sweet compounds, with researchers studying this particular sensory system finding that human sweet taste sensitivity appears specifically calibrated toward detecting even relatively small quantities of sugar, consistent with the broader evolutionary logic already discussed extensively throughout this topic regarding sweetness serving as a truly valuable, reliable signal for calorie-dense, generally safe food sources throughout most of our species' evolutionary history. Let's talk about ancient Persian sugar refining and trade specifically too, because this represents an important, historically significant regional development worth exploring in additional depth, connecting directly to sugar's broader westward historical spread already touched on earlier throughout this topic. Ancient Persia developed increasingly significant sugar refining and trading operations, playing an important historical role specifically in transmitting sugar production knowledge and technique further westward toward the broader Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world, representing an important intermediate historical link connecting sugar's original South and Southeast Asian development already discussed extensively throughout this topic to its eventual, considerably later arrival within European food culture and trade networks. Let's talk about how sugar was actually used within these earlier historical periods before it became a common everyday sweetener, too, because this represents an interesting, practically relevant detail worth exploring specifically before wrapping up this broader discussion. During the extended historical period when sugar remained a seriously expensive luxury item already discussed extensively throughout this topic, sugar frequently served specific specialized purposes beyond simply everyday sweetening, including medicinal applications, since various historical medical traditions specifically valued sugar for its perceived therapeutic properties and prestigious display purposes, with wealthy individuals sometimes commissioning elaborate sugar sculptures specifically to demonstrate their own considerable wealth and status during significant social occasions and celebrations. Let's talk about how sugar's arrival specifically transformed European cuisine and food culture too, because this represents an important, historically significant cultural development worth exploring in additional depth. As sugar gradually became more available within medieval and early modern Europe, though still remaining relatively expensive throughout much of this particular historical period, it began meaningfully influencing European cuisine and food preparation traditions, gradually contributing to the eventual development of increasingly elaborate dessert and confectionery traditions that would eventually become significant, distinctive features of various European culinary traditions across subsequent centuries of continued culinary development and refinement. Let's talk about the specific relationship between sugar availability and social class throughout much of this historical period too, because this represents an important, closely related social and economic dimension worth exploring before continuing this broader discussion. Given sugar's considerable historical expense already discussed extensively throughout this topic, sugar consumption frequently served as a visible marker of wealth and social status throughout much of this earlier historical period, with elaborate sugar-based dishes and confections specifically signaling considerable wealth and social prestige, representing another example of a broader historical pattern where access to specific, expensive luxury goods frequently carried significant social and status-related meaning, extending well beyond the item's own purely practical or nutritional value alone. Let's talk about sugarcane's specific historical domestication and processing too, because this represents perhaps the most historically significant development worth exploring in considerable additional depth, eventually leading directly toward the refined sugar most people today immediately associate with this broader topic. Sugarcane was first domesticated in New Guinea many thousands of years ago, with early cultivation practices gradually spreading to South and Southeast Asia, where ancient populations developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for processing sugarcane specifically to extract and concentrate its naturally sweet juice. This detail is worth appreciating because it represents the crucial technological turning point that eventually enabled seriously concentrated, purified sugar production, moving well beyond the more limited natural sweetness sources, honey and whole fruit specifically, that had represented early humans' primary sweet taste experience throughout most of our species' prior history. Let's talk about how sugar processing technology gradually developed and became increasingly sophisticated too, because this represents an important technical developmental process worth exploring specifically. Ancient sugarcane processors developed increasingly refined techniques for extracting sugarcane juice and gradually concentrating it through controlled heating and evaporation, eventually producing increasingly purified, crystallized sugar considerably more concentrated and considerably more storable and transportable compared to the raw sugarcane juice this entire process actually originated from. Ancient India specifically developed particularly significant early sugar refining techniques, with historical evidence confirming sophisticated sugar crystallization methods developing there well over 2,000 years ago. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3 plus hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about how sugar eventually spread beyond its original South and Southeast Asian origin too, because this represents an important, historically significant geographic development worth exploring before continuing this broader discussion. Sugar production and consumption gradually spread westward through trade networks and eventually direct cultivation in new regions, reaching the Middle East and eventually parts of the Mediterranean world during the medieval period, though sugar generally remained a really expensive, considerably rare luxury item throughout much of this earlier historical spread, accessible primarily to wealthy individuals rather than representing the widely accessible, inexpensive everyday commodity. Modern people today typically take completely for granted. Let's talk about the specific historical scale and severity of colonial-era sugar plantation labor systems in additional detail too, because this represents an important, historically significant dimension deserving direct, honest acknowledgement rather than passing mention alone. The dramatic expansion of sugar production during the colonial era relied extensively on forced labor systems, including the large-scale use of enslaved people specifically transported and forced to work within sugar plantation operations across various colonial territories, representing a truly severe historical human cost directly connected to sugar's eventual transition toward broader availability and affordability, already discussed throughout this topic. This detail deserves direct, honest historical acknowledgement since presenting sugar's broader historical story without directly addressing this significant, well-documented human cost would fail the basic historical responsibility of accurately representing this particular chapter's genuine, serious human consequences alongside its more straightforwardly celebrated technological and economic developments already explored extensively throughout the rest of this topic. Let's talk about archaeological evidence connecting increased sugar consumption to documented changes in dental health, too, because this represents an interesting, scientifically grounded dimension worth exploring, specifically before continuing this broader discussion. Researchers studying ancient and historical skeletal remains have found that populations with greater documented sugar access and consumption frequently show correspondingly increased evidence of tooth decay and other dental health problems compared to populations with more limited historical sugar access, providing direct physical, archaeological evidence connecting increased sugar consumption to measurable health consequences, extending back well before modern nutritional science had formally identified and confirmed this particular relationship through more contemporary scientific research methods and understanding. Let's talk about the eventual industrialization of sugar refining and its dramatic effect on sugar's broader accessibility too, because this represents an important, considerably more recent chapter worth exploring in additional depth, extending beyond simply the colonial plantation expansion already discussed extensively throughout this topic. Beginning particularly during the 19th century, increasingly mechanized, industrialized sugar refining techniques further dramatically increased production efficiency and correspondingly decreased sugar's price. Connecting directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding industrialization's transformative historical effect across numerous different industries and product categories more generally, eventually completing sugar's dramatic historical transformation from seriously rare, expensive luxury item into the thoroughly ordinary, inexpensive everyday commodity most people today take completely for granted. Let's talk about sugar beet as an important alternative sugar source that developed considerably later too, because this represents an interesting, technically significant development worth exploring specifically before wrapping up this broader discussion. Beyond sugarcane already discussed extensively throughout this topic, researchers eventually discovered that sugar beets could also serve as a viable, commercially practical sugar source, with sugar beet cultivation and processing developing particularly significantly during the 19th century especially within certain European regions less climatically suited to sugarcane cultivation specifically, representing an important technological diversification that further expanded global sugar production capability and geographic distribution beyond simply the traditional sugarcane growing regions already discussed extensively throughout the rest of this topic. Let's talk about how contemporary nutritional science has specifically informed modern understanding regarding sugar consumption, too, because this represents a fitting, forward looking connection worth including before this discussion concludes. Contemporary nutritional research has extensively studied sugar consumption's various health effects, building directly upon and considerably expanding beyond the more limited historical dental health evidence already discussed extensively throughout this topic, contributing to increasingly sophisticated modern public health understanding and guidance regarding appropriate sugar consumption levels, representing an important ongoing scientific research area that continues actively developing and refining contemporary understanding regarding this now thoroughly ubiquitous, but historically quite recently developed, dietary ingredient. Let's talk about how researchers actually study and confirm this gradual sugar and sweetness historical development too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Researchers rely on archaeological evidence, including preserved plant remains and specialized ancient sugar processing equipment, alongside historical written records documenting sugar trade and consumption patterns, allowing researchers to trace this gradual historical development with considerable scientific and historical precision across these various different regions and historical periods already discussed extensively throughout this topic. Let's talk about how sugar eventually transitioned from expensive luxury toward widely accessible everyday commodity too, because this represents an important, considerably later historical chapter worth exploring before wrapping up this broader discussion, connecting directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding colonial era plantation agriculture and its considerable historical significance. Sugar's eventual transition toward broader, considerably more widespread accessibility connected directly to large scale plantation agriculture developing during the colonial era, dramatically increasing overall sugar production and correspondingly decreasing its price. Though this particular chapter of sugar's broader historical story involved truly significant, well documented human cost connected directly to the forced labor systems these large scale plantation operations frequently relied upon during this specific historical period. Let's talk briefly about the eventual development of artificial and alternative sweeteners, too, because this represents a fitting, contemporary continuation worth including before this discussion concludes. Beginning particularly during the 20th century, researchers developed various artificial and alternative sweetening compounds specifically designed to provide sweetness without the same caloric content, or, in certain cases, the same documented health considerations associated with traditional sugar consumption already discussed extensively throughout this topic, representing the latest chapter in humanity's remarkably long, continuously evolving relationship with sweetness, extending directly from early humans' first taste of wild honey many tens of thousands of years ago through this considerably more recent, scientifically sophisticated modern development, specifically addressing contemporary nutritional and health considerations regarding sweetness and sugar consumption more broadly. Let's talk about how sugar's specific historical trajectory compares to other significant foods and ingredients already explored throughout other discussions, too, because this represents a fitting, unifying final point worth including before this discussion concludes. Sugar's historical journey, from rare, geographically limited natural sweetness through gradual agricultural domestication and increasingly sophisticated processing technology, eventually culminating in truly widespread modern accessibility, echoes broader patterns already explored extensively throughout other discussions regarding numerous other significant foods and materials, illustrating a consistent, recurring historical pattern where truly valuable resources and ingredients frequently begin as rare, geographically limited or expensive commodities before, gradually, through sustained accumulated human technological and agricultural development, eventually becoming the thoroughly ordinary, widely accessible, everyday items so many people today casually take completely for granted without a second thought. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full story of when early humans first tasted sugar turns out to reveal a seriously gradual, multi stage historical progression extending from early humans' first encounters with naturally sweet honey and fruit through ancient sugarcane domestication and increasingly sophisticated processing technique, eventually producing the concentrated, refined sugar that would, many centuries later, become the widely accessible everyday commodity most people today take completely for granted. So the next time you casually add sugar to your coffee or enjoy a sweet dessert, it's worth appreciating that you're benefiting from an extraordinarily long historical progression, stretching from early humans' first taste of wild honey through many centuries of gradually developing agricultural and processing technology, eventually producing this now thoroughly ordinary, easily accessible ingredient. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as seemingly simple and ordinary as sugar actually required this much accumulated historical and technological development to become the widely accessible everyday commodity we now take completely for granted, what does that suggest about how many other completely ordinary modern ingredients and foods might be quietly carrying a similarly deep, similarly overlooked history of gradual human agricultural and technological achievement, hiding in plain sight behind their current, thoroughly unremarkable everyday form